You may be surprised to know that pirates existed 2,000 years ago. But what may shock you even more are some of these brutal dishes that were commonly found in dire times on a swashbuckling pirate's dinner table. So join us as we go through some dinners that can make your stomach turn. Number 20. Raw fish. Historically, pirate life, forget gorgeous swashbuckling Johnny Depp in Pirates of the Caribbean, has been brutal, nasty, and short. Finding yourself stranded in the middle of the ocean with no source of food other than raw fish was not uncommon in the life of a rogue pirate 2,000 years ago. And when that happened, desperate measures had to be taken. Eating raw fish wasn't something anyone did for pleasure back then. There were no sushi rolls, no wasabi, no soy sauce to mask the taste. It was about survival, pure and simple. The fish, sometimes still wiggling, would be gutted right there on the deck. If there was no fire to cook it, or if time was of the essence, you'd have to eat it as it was, raw, slimy, and cold. Now, such a brutal meal may cause anyone's stomach to turn, but when it came to survival, anything went. The majority of pirates probably didn't survive to see 30, and a good number of them ended their careers abruptly on the gallows. It's a disappointingly unromantic, un-Jack Sparrow-like picture. And on top of that, pirates ate terrible food as well to survive. Well, that means we'll have to tick off pirating from the list of possible jobs then. Number 19. Fermented shark. Sharks and pirates have a long-standing relationship that goes beyond the ocean and straight into a pirate's mouth.
Yeah, a little. How is it?
Found everywhere in the sea, these scary creatures weren't just an easy way to get rid of prisoners or mutineers that you didn't want to keep on your ship. In desperate times, pirates would grab their fish hooks and catch as many sharks as possible. But there was a problem. Eating these Greenland sharks was toxic when they were fresh, so the pirates came up with an ingenious way to get rid of this problem. Now, fermented shark isn't like anything you've tasted before. It's not just fish left out to go bad. It's an ancient method of preservation, and it's downright brutal. The process begins by catching a Greenland shark, a massive creature with flesh that's toxic if eaten fresh. The fish is buried in gravelly sand, where it's left to rot and ferment for several weeks or even months. Afterward, it's dug up, cut into strips, and hung out to dry in the cold, salty air. By the time it's ready to eat, the shark meat has transformed into something almost unrecognizable. The smell alone is enough to make even the toughest pirate think twice. A powerful, nose-wrinkling stench of ammonia, like a mix of rotten eggs and strong cleansing chemicals. But out on the sea, with no other food in sight, you don't have the luxury of being picky. Number 18. Dried insects. If there's one thing you were sure to find on a pirate ship in large numbers, it was insects.
Spread onto trays and slipped into ovens to roast.
So in order to make the powder, the moisture has to be below a certain percentage. We find that if it's above that percentage.
Whether you went into the hold of the ship or the pantry, these bugs infested every part of the ship, feeding on whatever they can find in a dirty old pirate's brig. But what if we told you that the pirates kept them around for times of great need? Running away from pirate hunters and British ships meant staying out at sea for years, with no hope of receiving supplies for long periods. And when that happened, the pirates would initiate an open season on these unfortunate tiny creatures. Eating insects isn't what anyone signed up for when they set out to sea. But out here, survival is all that matters. You might find a stash of crickets, grasshoppers, or beetles, caught and dried back on land. or maybe even gathered from the ship's own nooks and crannies. They're lightweight, easy to carry, and packed with protein. But the thought of popping one into your mouth still makes you hesitate. The first thing you notice is the texture, dry, brittle, and with a crunch that feels unsettlingly similar to chewing on bits of old rope. There is a strange earthy flavor, something between wood and dust, with an aftertaste that lingers, reminding you of the dirt and grime of life at sea. You can feel the tiny legs and wings as you chew, a stark reminder that this isn't a meal you'd choose under any other circumstance. Number 17. Boiled seabirds. Picture this. You're a pirate, 2,000 years ago. The treasure map? Lost. The last coconut? Eaten.
To have two to compare. That was really beefy, and this is much more just like a dark meat that's a little bit more on the dry side.
The only thing left between you and starvation? These scrappy little feathered friends flapping about your ship. So, what do? You boil them, of course. But these aren't plump chickens or ducks from the farm. These are tough, wiry seabirds, gulls, albatrosses, or maybe a gannet. Their flesh is lean, their feathers coarse, and they smell strongly of fish from their ocean diet. But hunger doesn't care about such details, and so you do what you must. You boil the bird. Boiling was one of the simplest ways to prepare food on a ship, especially with limited resources. You'd pluck the bird, gut it quickly, and toss it into a pot of water. If you were lucky, you might have some herbs or salt to add, but often it was just water and bird. As it boiled, the smell would fill the ship, not the savory aroma of a home-cooked meal, but something much harsher, almost gamey, with a hint of salt and the unmistakable scent of the sea. The bones were brittle, and there wasn't much meat on them, but you ate what you could, gnawing down to the last morsel. It wasn't filling, it wasn't pleasant, but it was food, and out there on the unforgiving ocean, that was all that mattered. Number 16. Salted leather strips. Even if you were a dirty seafaring pirate on the rough sea, there was one thing you could not go without: leather shoes and belts. Now, what if you were stranded on an island with no food in sight and just your boots in your hand? You'd eat them, of course. And that's when you know things have gotten truly desperate. Because now you're staring down at a strap of salted leather, wondering how on earth this is going to pass for food. Salted leather strips weren't meant to be eaten. They were supposed to be used for making or repairing gear. But when hunger gnaws at you with no relief in sight, you start to reconsider. You grab that tough, stiff piece of leather and do what any desperate sailor would do. You throw it into a pot of boiling water. The boiling doesn't do much to soften it up. If anything, the leather just gets soggier, like an old boot that's been left out in the rain. The salt, intended to preserve it, only adds to the misery, turning what should be a meal into a salty, chewy, nearly inedible lump. But what choice do you have? A favorite story of seafarers is how Henry Morgan thought he could just live off the land and did not load food onto his ships. When the time came, his crew were so starved to death they would start eating their leather satchels. A recipe was to slice the leather, soak it, and then beat and rub between stones to soften it up. Scrape off all the hair and grill it upon fire, and then try to eat the pieces by making them small and with lots of water. Number 15. Crude seaweed. Yo ho ho, a pirate's diet for me. Wait, those aren't the words to the theme song from Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean ride? Those lyrics extol the virtues of a pirate's life, not diet, which is probably for the best. After all, the broad strokes of the Caribbean pirate's life are easily romanticized, but their diet? Well, that's another story, matey. Seaweed, for all its slimy green glory, is a far cry from the hearty meals you once enjoyed on land. It's tough, salty, and has the texture of wet paper. But when there's nothing else to eat, you grab whatever you can. You might tear it right off the rocks, the strands still dripping with seawater, or gather it from the waves, half hoping it's not hiding any unpleasant surprises. There's no time or means to get fancy with it. Maybe you boil it if you're lucky enough to have a fire going, but often you're eating it raw. The taste of salt and the ocean strong and overpowering. Every bite is a struggle, the seaweed slipping through your fingers as you try to tear off a piece. It's chewy, rubbery, and leaves a lingering aftertaste that's a mix of salt and bitterness. Number 14. Raw oysters and clams. Don't expect fine dining on the high seas. With dirty conditions, scarce clean clothes, and constant threats from other ships, the pirate life was a tough one, especially when it came to food.
Thing is, raw oysters have to be alive when you eat them.
Picture this: raw oysters and clams. Not exactly a pirate's dream meal. No fancy garnishes, just you and a slimy, salty morsel straight from the sea. Swallowing it down was the easy part. The hard part was trying not to think about what you were really eating. But these aren't normal circumstances. Out here, with your stomach gnawing at you and no other food in sight, raw oysters and clams became a lifeline. They're fresh, they're full of nutrients, and most importantly, they're right there for the taking. You eat as many as you can find, cracking shell after shell, swallowing them down as quickly as possible. Number 13. Rat stew. Pirate ships are probably the only place where you couldn't yell out, "Waiter, there's a rat in my soup."
Lost my appetite. We have to eat something. I can't. Not while my people are starving.
Because you were probably the one who put it in there in the first place. Whenever someone says the word pirate ship, one of the few things that we can picture in our mind is the deck of the ship with rats running around in the dark corners. And that wasn't far from the truth because the pirates weren't bothered. This was just free meat living with them until they were desperate enough to actually boil them in a stew. In an ordinary world, rats are pests, dirty and uninviting. But out here, they're a last resort. So, you and your crew, facing starvation, set about catching these furry intruders. It's not a pretty process. Rats are trapped or hunted with whatever means you have, and you're left with a pile of small, scurrying rodents. Cooking them up isn't exactly a culinary event. There's no time or ingredients for a gourmet meal. You throw the rats into a pot of boiling water, fur, bones, and all. The water starts to simmer, and the smell fills the air, a mixture of damp, fur, and the unmistakable tang of desperation. As the stew simmers, you can't help but notice how unappetizing it looks. The rats are small, their bones are brittle, and their meat is sparse. The broth is murky and uninviting, a grim shade of brown with bits of rat floating around. But when you're starving, it's the only thing you've got. Number 12. Hardtack infested with weevils. From the image of sailors eating them in the dark, as to not see the weevils while sailors breaking their teeth on them, hardtack is familiar to anybody interested in naval life.
Throughout the hardtack, and it's all the food that these guys would have sometimes. I mean, it's not like they could get a resupply so easily all the time. Sometimes they could.
Ship's biscuit is nothing more than unleavened bread that has been baked several times in order to remove as much moisture as possible. This allows it to be stored for an extremely long time. The issue with taking fresh bread on a ship is that even when adequately stored, it will not last more than a few weeks aboard a ship. It will mold and cease to be edible. Ship's biscuit addresses that problem. Many sailors became so accustomed to ship's biscuits that they distrusted regular bread and refused to eat it. The taste is bland, a mix of flour and old salt. with an unsettling hint of the bugs that have made their home inside. You can't quite get rid of the knowledge that you're munching on a food that was infested long before it reached your plate. It's like chewing on a piece of history with a side of creepy crawlers. Despite the crunch and the faintly unpleasant taste, you eat it because you have no other choice. The weevils are a grim reminder of just how dire things have gotten. They might be small, but their presence is a huge blow to morale. Every bite is a reminder of the harsh reality of life at sea, where even the most basic provisions can become a source of disgust. Number 11. Jellied Eels. To the uninitiated, the thought of jellied eels makes some people shudder.
Our jellied eel bowls are ready, and they will now rest for about a day.
Perhaps it is the thought of the jelly that turns people off, or the association with images of snakes of the sea. How wrong can people be? Jellied eels might sound exotic, but to a pirate with no choice, it's just another step in the survival game. You start by boiling the eels until they're tender. Once cooked, you remove the bones and chop the flesh into pieces. Then, you set about making the jelly. This involves simmering the eel heads and bones to make a gelatinous broth, which you then mix with the eel meat and let it cool. The result is a gelatinous jelly-like dish, kind of like a savory jelly that's supposed to be more about preservation than pleasure. Number 10. Turtle meat and eggs. When you were a child, did you ever dream about being a pirate? Perhaps you were carried away with the tales of Blackbeard, Captain Hook, and the like. Maybe the idea of being on the sea, fighting battles, and stealing treasure excited your imagination. However, once you find out about the next brutal dinner that pirates ate, you may want to keep that dream tucked away in a corner. One solution to get food was to look for them on islands where turtles nested. On the islands where the turtles went to lay their eggs, they were very easy to capture. The pirates would wait until dusk, and when the turtles appeared, they would turn them over by resting them on their shells. This prevented them from escaping, as they were unable to turn around on their own. Later, they were loaded into the ship's hold and kept alive to provide fresh food. And then there were the eggs, dozens, sometimes hundreds buried in the sand. These eggs are a rare find, a treasure that offer a break from the monotony of dried, salted provisions. They're like nature's little protein bombs. They might be slimy and weird, but crack them open and you got yourself an island omelet. Number 9. Salted beef. Pirates 2,000 years ago had it rough. For months, they were away at sea, sustaining themselves on an unsteady diet that included brined beef, dirty water, and tough crackers. In the days before pasteurization, seasickness likely came more often from the food than the waves. Salted beef, or salt junk, as it was sometimes called, is far from the succulent, juicy cuts you might imagine. This isn't a steak sizzling on the grill. It's more like a block of aged leather that's been soaked in salt until every last bit of moisture is gone. After 2 months, the salted beef smelled gnarly and didn't look fresh, but it wasn't quite rotten either. Salted beef was tougher than a mermaid's tail and saltier than a sailor's language. When it's time to eat, there's no fancy preparation involved. You dig into the barrel where the salted beef is stored, pull out a slab, and you're immediately hit with the smell, a pungent, overpowering scent of old meat and salt that clings to your nostrils. The salt is there to preserve it, to keep it from rotting in the hot, humid conditions on board the ship. But it also makes the beef tough, incredibly salty, and almost impossible to chew. Number 8. Rotten eggs. Before setting sail, the ship would be stocked with food that would keep throughout the voyage.
Disregard the color of the yolk. It varies in accordance with the hen's diet, and a green ring on a hard-cooked yolk.
Remember, there was no refrigeration back then. In many areas, salted meats, dried beans or rice, and pickled foods could be kept aboard for long periods of time. But eggs you couldn't preserve for a long time, and so rotten eggs were still eaten when times got tough. Rotten eggs are the last resort of desperate pirates. When you're weeks into a voyage and your stores are all but depleted, you don't have the luxury of being picky. The reality of life at sea is that you eat what you have, even if what you have is something that would make a rat think twice. Cooking the eggs doesn't help much either. The heat might kill off some of the bacteria, but it does nothing to mask that awful smell. If anything, it just spreads the stench throughout the ship, turning your galley into a nauseating cloud of rotten fumes. The texture is no better. The eggs are slimy, runny, and lumpy all at once, making each bite a challenge to keep down. Number 7, rotten cheese. Cheese was a pirate's favorite food, but what if it was stored in a damp, humid hold of a ship for months on end?
Si dice che è molto pericoloso, ma non lo è affatto.
This here is cheese that's been through hell and back. Left to fester in the heat and humidity of a pirate ship, it's gone from a tasty treat to a moldy monstrosity. This isn't the kind of cheese you'd put on a cracker and enjoy with a glass of wine. No, this cheese has been sitting in a hot, humid ship for weeks, maybe months. The edges are slimy, the smell is overpowering, and you can see patches of green and blue mold spreading across the surface. The texture is the first thing you notice. It's grainy, slimy, and sticks to your teeth in the worst way. The taste is sharp and sour, with an underlying bitterness that makes anyone winch. It's not just unpleasant, it's downright brutal, like a punch to the gut. But the pirates had to force it down, because in the harsh reality of pirate life, food is food, even if it's barely edible. Number 6, blood sausages. Forget love, forget war, forget decency and kindness. It's sausages that all of us, all over the world, have in common.
The sausages found in supermarkets all over the world are stuffed into casings of plastic. This gives the black pudding a longer shelf life.
And they were even present all those years ago in a pirate ship's pantry. But these sausages were made of something that might make your stomach turn. This is blood sausage, pirate style, made from the freshest, oldest blood and whatever bits of meat they could scrape together, all stuffed into a casing. The blood used to make the sausage could be days or even weeks old, barely kept from spoiling by the salt air and whatever preservatives you have on hand. The meat is whatever scraps you could salvage, often tough, fatty, and anything but fresh. And the casing? It's usually made from the intestines of whatever animals you managed to slaughter before setting sail, cleaned as best as you could manage in less than ideal conditions. When you cut into the sausage, the first thing that hits you is the smell, a heavy, metallic scent mixed with the faint odor of decay. Blood sausage might be a far cry from the hearty meals you've dreamed about, but it's fuel to keep you working the ropes, manning the oars, and facing the dangers of pirate life. Arr. Number 5, raw sea urchins. It tastes like what you would imagine a salty brain tastes like. This is how the taste of a raw sea urchin is described.
If you put sea urchin in water, tentacles.
Now imagine being a pirate starving for days coming across one. It's a feast fit for a king. Sea urchins aren't exactly what you'd call gourmet fare. These spiky little critters look more like something you'd find in a horror movie than on a dinner plate. They're covered in sharp, venomous spines that can easily puncture skin if you're not careful. But desperate times call for desperate measures, And when you're out of options, sea urchins become a last resort meal. First off, the sheer effort it takes to get to the food inside the sea urchin is enough to test anyone's patience. You need to carefully pry open the urchin's hard shell, which is no small feat. The spines might be the least of your worries. The real challenge is dealing with the gritty, mucousy substance inside. Once you manage to crack it open, you're greeted with a slimy, orange mass of roe. This is the edible part, though edible is a relative term here. Number 4. Crab roe. Crab roe is the eggs of the crab. And while they might sound like a delicacy, they're not exactly appetizing when you're facing a grim pirate's diet.
Seriously, some of the best fried rice you'll ever eat right there. Those crab legs, they're just so burst in your mouth, flavorful. And then
when fresh crab roe is a rich, orangey red substance that's packed into the crab's body cavity. It's supposed to be full of nutrients, but the reality of eating it at sea is far from glamorous. Crabs are armored with hard shells and spiny legs, so cracking them open to get to the roe isn't exactly a walk in the park. You need to carefully pry open the shell and scoop out the delicate eggs, which are often mixed with other crab innards. The roe itself is slimy and gooey, with a texture that's more unsettling than inviting. And the taste? Oh, it's a real treat. And by treat you mean an explosion of briny, fishy flavor that'll stick to your taste buds, like barnacles to a hull. Number 3. Beef jerky. Imagine yourself as a pirate 2,000 years ago, braving the unpredictable ocean with a crew of wary sailors. Your ship is creaking under the strain of endless days at sea.
Now, in the case of traditional jerky, the smoking and marinade are all that is needed to make the jerky taste good.
And fresh food is a distant memory. As you sit down for a dinner after a hard day of work on the ship deck, you're served with a thick, chewy beef jerky that would make your teeth grind for hours. Beef jerky back then was quite a different beast compared to what you might find in modern convenience stores. Without the benefit of modern preservatives or packaging, this ancient version of jerky was essentially dried meat preserved through a combination of salting, smoking, and sometimes sun-drying. It was a hardy, durable food designed to withstand the rigors of long voyages. When you pull out a piece of this jerky, it's a tough, leathery slab of meat. The texture is far from tender. It's like chewing on a piece of old leather, with every bite requiring significant effort to get through. The jerky is hard and brittle, often with a gritty exterior that feels like chewing through a dried-up sponge. Number 2. Starfish. Who would have ever thought these cute, harmless creatures could ever be part of a pirate's cuisine? But such was the brutal reality 2,000 years ago. Starfish, or sea stars as they're sometimes called, aren't exactly the first choice for a meal. These marine creatures are not known for their culinary appeal, and they can be quite a challenge to prepare and eat. They have a rough, spiny exterior that protects a soft, somewhat gelatinous interior, and eating them requires more than a little effort. The taste of starfish is, well, unique. It's not the kind of flavor that screams delicious. Instead, it has a briny, seaweed-like taste with a hint of the ocean's rawness. The texture can be a bit off-putting. It's somewhat mushy, and the flavor is intense in a way that makes it clear you're eating something that lives in the depth of the sea. Cooking starfish doesn't exactly turn into a gourmet feast. It's a bit like trying to make a shoe taste good by adding spices. It's often described as having a flavor that's more about the ocean than anything pleasant, like chewing on a piece of seafloor itself. Number 1. Congealed Animal Fat. This last brutal dish is like a jelly donut, but instead of jelly, it's a big slabby hunk of fat that's about as appetizing as a bucket of grease. But when your pantry was empty and your stomach rumbled louder than a cannon, this dish came to your rescue. Congealed animal fats are essentially just fat that's been rendered and then solidified, often from beef or pork. Back in the day, pirates didn't have refrigeration or fancy preservation methods, so that was preserved by cooking it down and letting it cool into a solid mass. It was a practical way to make a calorie-dense food that wouldn't spoil quickly, but it was far from appetizing. The taste is equally brutal. Animal fat has a strong, fatty flavor that can be quite overwhelming. It's rich, greasy, and can leave a slick, oily residue in your mouth that doesn't go away easily. If you've ever had a dish where the fat wasn't properly rendered, you might have experienced the feeling of eating something that's less than pleasant. Now, imagine that sensation intensified and extended over a whole meal. These were 20 brutal dinners that pirates used to have 2,000 years ago. If you think we missed anything, do let us know below in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.